Derek Gray, and I'm with the product management team with the civil engineering applications. Our topic today is, when they gave it to me, they said, we want you to do a presentation on data migration and workflows. Now, I knew immediately, because I've done some presentation or presenting in this area before, that this is a kind of a difficult presentation to put together. And the reason for that is because most of the time when we think about moving or migrating data, we tend to focus on software versions, you know, SS2, SS4, SS10, or Connect. In other words, we think about, well, I've got SS2 data and I need to go to, you know, ORD, or I've got SS10 data that needs to go to ORD Connect. But that's a little bit difficult to focus on versions, though. And the reason for that is because data can vary so much. Let me give you an example. You could have, for example, a Geopack project in SS10 that uses absolutely no OpenRoads technology at all. You could have another Geopack project in SS10 that uses OpenRoads technology. Or, for example, you could have an SS4 inroads project that uses a lot of OpenRoads technology, but the drainage could still be done in, say, for example, inroads S&S. So you get the idea here that you can't really focus on versions, and so we're not going to do that today. What we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 different examples. The first example we're going to look at is a V8i project that has no OpenRoads data in it. Again, this could be SS2, SS4, or SS10. Then we're going to look at a V8i project that does have OpenRoads data in it. And then finally, we'll look at a Connect project or an OpenRoads project that we're moving from version to version, for example, from 10.8 to 10.9 to 10.10, and so on and so forth. So again, these will be kind of the 3 areas that we're going to look at. Now, I'm going to focus today specifically on moving project data. I'm going to assume that a Connect workspace is already created. Now, before we get into those 3 types of projects, I want to talk about a new tool that we introduced in 2021 R2 that really we're going to use it a lot, especially when we're migrating data. We're going to use it in that first project, which is non-OpenRoads. We use it in the second one, and we'll even use it sometimes in Connect if the occasion arises. Now, feature remapper at its basis is basically used to remap feature definitions from one standard to another. So think, for example, I've got SS4 data and I've got a V8i workspace, and I migrate that data to OpenRoads and Connect, but something has changed. Maybe we've renamed some features, maybe we've deleted some features, or maybe some features have been moved in their directory structure. And so when the data is migrated, it can't find its feature, right? So it just comes in color white, wrong level, wrong color, that kind of thing. So we need to remap feature definitions. Now, prior to 2021 R2, this was a manual process. You just had to go in and do it manually. In that version, 2021 R2, we introduced feature remapper, and on the first version, you could run it against ITL and IRD files. In this upcoming release of 2022 R1, we've expanded that now into DGN and DGN Lives. You can remap terrains and corridors and geometry. Now, we're not done yet. There's a couple things we've got to add, for example, DNU features, 3D linear geometries, but this tool is going to be a key part of mapping or migrating your data. Now let's take a look at how this works up front. So here I've got a corridor, and it's in OpenRoads Designer, but you'll notice immediately over on the corridor that something's wrong, right? There's no colors, there's no materials. The features aren't being found, right? If I look over at my alignment, it comes in yellow. Well, I know that it should have come in red. So something's wrong with the features, that it can't find the right ones to symbolize. So I'm going to go backstage to the Civil Tools, and I'm going to go open the Feature Remapper, and I'm going to select a configuration file that I've already got set up, and I'm just simply going to hit Remap. And what it's going to do is it's going to automatically remap those to the correct features. It's just that simple. So now, of course, if I go over into the 3D, you can see the colors and levels and materials are there. My alignment now shows up as red instead of yellow. So that's how it works. Now let's go back real quickly and see how this whole thing goes. So I mentioned we have to select a configuration file. So let's edit this configuration file. Now the configuration file does three things. The first thing it does is it allows you to define what categories do you want to remap. Do you want me to look for terrains and geometry and corridors, templates, those kind of things. The other thing it says, do you want me to map in the active DGN, or do you want me to remap against an ITL and an IRD file? The third thing that it asks for is a spreadsheet. Now this is really the backbone of what's going on. So let's take a look at this spreadsheet. You can see on the bottom you've got multiple tabs for terrain and geometry and corridors. But it's very simple. For example, in a geometry, this is my from feature. This is what it was in the V8i workspace. This is what it is in the Connect workspace, or I could go from connect to connect. For example, under corridor, this is what it was. This is the feature that I want you to map it to. So you can drill down. For example, you can look at inside the template and look at the point features and say, hey, it was this in one workspace. I want you to map it to another one in another workspace. Now you'll notice here I'm not mapping anything on the point features, and the reason for that is I want to base them on the point name, and this just kind of gives you an idea of some of the granularity that you have. So let's take, for example, 3 edge of pavement points. In the old workspace, they all map to the same feature, edge of pavement. But in the workspace that I'm coming into, I actually want to map those points to 3 different features. So it just kind of gives you an idea of some of the detail that you can dig down into. Of course, as we move along, you can remap your components, your component names, and so on and so forth. So basically, that's how it works. It reads the spreadsheet, and you just click remap, and boom, you're off and running. Now I mentioned I just showed you how we could do that against a DGN file. You can do that against ITLs and IRDs. So here I selected a configuration file. I said remap. I selected the ITL, and it went into that ITL and it remapped it. Now, if you want to see the results, you can just go back and look at the original ITL file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open, when I remapped it, it actually created a backup for me. So I'm going to open that BAK file, which is my original template library. And you'll notice if I come in, everything is gray and black. And if I double click on a component or a point, it'll give me an error message that it can't find the feature definition. Okay, that was the problem, right? So now I'm going to go open the remapped one, the Meadow Park ITL, and when I go down into the templates here, I'll see my colors are showing up. More importantly, if I double click on a point or an end condition or a component, you can see the features are all assigned properly. This same configuration file, I could remap an IRD. So if I had an IRD file, say from SS2, I can just say, hey, I want to use that config file, click remap, select the IRD file that I want to remap, say OK, and it's automatically done. So I wanted to show you this up front because no matter what type of project data we're migrating, anytime you need to remap features, this tool is what you are going to want to use. Now, the nice thing about this is we have set it up to run in a batch process. So we give you a key in called Civil Feature Remapper. There are 2 parameters. One is required, which is the path to your configuration file. The other one is optional, and that would only be needed if you're remapping an ITL or an ORD file. Or an IRD file. So again, you want to use this with the batch process tool. So let's take a look at how this might work. So I'm going to go back to onto my backstage under tools. I'm going to open the batch process application. And so it's pretty straightforward. The first thing you do is you just add a list of DGN files that you want to remap. So I'm not going to select my entire project because it would just, again, we'd have to sit here and watch the whole thing. So I'm going to select my corridor files. I'm going to go to my geometry directory and I'm going to select all of my geometry files. And then I'm finally going to go to my terrain and we'll just add the, let's add the terrain in here, okay? So I've got this list now of files. Now it asks you, do you want me to look at all models or just the default? Well, now most of these files are going to have default models and default 3D, so I want to look at all of them. And then finally you look at your batch file or your text file, and again it's just very simple, civil feature remapper, and I point to my configuration file that I want it to run. By the way, you can save this off, the contents of this dialog. You can save this off as what's called a BPRC file, which is basically a batch process job file, just in case you need to come back at some point, so you don't have to re-enter all that information. Once you've got it all in there, basically it's pretty straightforward. You just say, I want to process the batch job, and it comes up and you just say process. Now what it's going to do is it's going to go through every one of those models in those files, and it's going to run the feature remapper key in, and so if it finds geometry that needs to be remapped, it'll remap it. If it finds corridors that need to be remapped, it'll remap the features in those. Same thing with terrain and so on and so forth. So again, I just wanted to kind of show you that up front, because this can be used throughout our data migration process. Okay, with that out of the way, let's turn, if we can, to the first type of one of our projects that we're going to be migrating. And this would be a V8i project that doesn't have any OpenRoads in it. Now, there's a good best practice that I want to give you, and I'll remind you of this as we move through. Anytime you're migrating data, one of the best practice is to go into your V8i project or whatever project you're bringing forward and run some reports. So create geometry reports, terrain reports, super, corridor, drainage, so on and so forth. And then once we get the data moved, what we'll do is we'll generate those same reports in the new version, and we can compare them to make sure our geometry and everything came across correctly. So that's just a good best practice when you're migrating data. Now let's turn back to, remember, we're migrating V8i projects that for the most part have no OpenRoads data. So this is basically going to turn into an import process. So you're going to be, whether you've got geometry and terrains and IRDs or super or drainage, at the end of the day, you're going to be importing it into OpenRoads. And so let's kind of walk through that process and see how that would work. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to import a terrain. So most of you guys, I'm sure, have maybe done this. It's pretty straightforward. We just import the terrain. This video I'm doing OpenRoads DTM, but we also do Geopack 10, MXFIL files, and XML. So you just say, hey, I want to import a terrain. I'm going to identify my source file units. I'm going to give it a feature definition that I want to be applied automatically when it brings in. And then under the import options, we can do terrain, features, or both. In this case, I'm just going to do the terrain because I want my features in a separate file. So I've imported my terrain just like that. You've taken this OpenRoads DTM and converted it into an OpenRoads terrain. Now I'm going to open a new file. This was blank, and I'm going to, this is a 3D file, of course, and I'm going to bring in my features. Once again, we can set our feature definition, we can set our source file units. Notice I'm going to set this to import features only. I'm going to toggle on name all features just in case there were some features that weren't named. I'll have it assigned a name. We'll import those, and you can see the features have all been brought in. If I hover over them, you're going to see they have names, so I can differentiate edge of pavements from ditches and other types of features. The last thing we would do is of course to update the feature definitions. We can do this via Project Explorer, or we'll be able to do it with Feature Remapper in a future version. The next thing we want to do is import our geometry. Now, a couple of caveats here coming in for those of you that may not be familiar with OpenRoads, and you're going to be needing to bring some project data forward. The first one is this: you do not need to import your existing ground profiles. In ORD, the existing ground profiles are generated automatically from the terrain, so you do not need to worry about doing that. The second caveat would be in the area of Geopack. For those that are Geopack users, you'll know that in Geopack, the profiles are not children of parent geometry. For example, in InRoads, you have a piece of geometry. The profiles are tied to it in a children-parent relationship. That is not true in Geopack. So anytime you import alignments inside of Geopack, you have to assign the proper profiles to that parent alignment. Now, it will try to help you just by looking at the name. So for example, in the screen grab that I've got, the alignment's called ramp 1. It will look at the profiles and try to figure out for you which one they are, but it's basically a name matching game. So you can see here it found ramp 1 EX and ramp 1 PR. It toggled them on automatically. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to you to define what profiles you want to be brought in with what geometry if you're migrating Geopack data. Okay, let's import some geometry and see some of the options that are available to you. I'm going to start by importing an InRoads ALG file. So here's an InRoads ALG file. You can see I've got multiple features or styles, as we'd call them in say an SS2. And so here same thing with features and same thing with alignments and points. I'm going to select a couple of different features. And I'm going to, for the alignments, and I'm going to select a couple from the points. Now, down in the dialog, I'm going to assign all the alignments to a particular linear feature. I'm going to assign all the points to a particular linear feature. So this would be an example of many to one. I'd say, hey, I got all these features over here in this V8i project. I want to bring them forward, and I want to assign them all to this, in this case, geom baseline. And you can see same thing here. I've got all these features that are point features, but I want to assign them to a single point feature. So that's an example of many to one. Here's another example. Here's a GPK. Now in this GPK, the alignments don't have any features. They weren't assigned any features. So I'm going to go through and pick a bunch of alignments and say, hey, when you bring them in, assign them to geom baseline. And that's exactly what it did. You can see here they all came in with very similar symbologies. If I go over to Project Explorer and I look at the feature definitions, you can see all those alignments got assigned to geom baseline. Now, what if you don't want to take different features to a single one? What if you want to map to multiple linear or point features? Well, let's go back to our InRoads ALG. So I'm going to once again do bring in some data, and I want to map different features, but instead of defining them or mapping them to a single one, I'm going to use a spreadsheet. So we allow you to set up a spreadsheet. It's got two tabs. You can see the first tab is for the alignments, and there's the from feature, and then there's the to feature that you want to take it to. The second tab is for points. Again, you're defining the from feature and the to feature. It's very straightforward. This is all documented in the help. Once you've got that spreadsheet set up, you can say, I want to assign feature definitions from a table. By the way, there is a config variable that'll point to this, so you can set it up one time and just use it over and over again. So what it did that time is it read that spreadsheet and it made the feature mapping determinations from the spreadsheet. So it brought the appropriate ones into baseline and baseline secondary. Same thing for the points. It mapped them as per the spreadsheet. You can also use wildcards. Let me go back to the GPK file, and I'm going to go down to a point list. Now, here's a bunch of different features. I've got B, BD, BM, Bush. I can use wildcards. I can say, hey, find every feature that starts with a B and bring them into borehole, or find every feature that starts with LINE, and I want you to map them to a particular feature. So there's a lot of functionality here, a lot of granularity that you can use to get your features mapped from your V8i project up toward to a Connect project. And you can see here, I'm just showing you as we drill down in the feature definitions, the points all came across into the whatever it asked them to do. The last thing I want to look at is a special case, and the special case here is GenIO files. Now, GenIO files, by their nature, do not contain any feature definitions. They only contain string names. And so you're never going to have any features here. So the MX users had said, well, I'd like to be able to map them into features. So for GenIO files, if it knows it's a GenIO file, when it sees the spreadsheet, the from column, it will read those as string names, not feature names. And it gives our GenIO users the ability to basically map string names across into Connect as features. So again, a lot of functionality here that you can use, and I'll just again let this play out here. We'll import the GenIO file. It reads the string names and it maps them into the appropriate symbologies. So we've got our terrain in, we've got our geometry in. Let's turn to super elevation. Now, there's really two ways that you can get your super elevation in from a non-OpenRoads project. If you want to bring them into a separate file, then you really want to use the CSV method. Now, it will come in as an IRD, and you'll see that here in a moment. I'll show you how that works, but I'm going to show you how to bring it in through a CSV first. Now, there's one caveat here, and that is before importing super from a CSV, you will need to have your super section and your lanes configured. So I've got my super section built, I've got my lanes configured. I'm going to point to a CSV file that I want to bring forward. Now, on the right is the proper definition that we need, or the proper format for the CSV file to bring in. On the left is a report from one of our legacy products. So you may have to do some formatting to get it in the right format to bring it in. By the way, the appropriate format is documented in the help, so that's all explained for you. Here I've got it in the right format. I'm going to say, hey, I want to bring in the CSV file. We just need to make sure that our super points and our lanes are configured correctly, which I'm just making sure of here. Once I've got that, I say OK, and and you'll see it's automatically brought in. You can see the colors change and so on and so forth. So it's a fairly straightforward progress. Now, I'm going to be really honest with you here. Because you've got to create your super sections and you have to create your lane configurations, and more than likely you're going to have to do some formatting on your CSV file, it may be just as efficient for you to just go into ORD and just rebuild your super from scratch if you've got your workspace set up for your design speeds and all of that. Again, I'll leave it up to you, but you know, if it was me, I'd find it just more efficient just to kind of start over. Now, I mentioned earlier that's one method to do it. The other method is to bring it in into as part of the IRD. So if you have an IRD, it will come in as part of that IRD. The only problem with this workflow is that you don't have the option of putting it in a separate file from the corridor, which is, you know, most people like to keep their super, you know, in a separate file from the corridor. If you do it this way through the IRD, you know, you don't have that option. It's automatically going to go in to the same file. Now, so in my case, I've already brought it in a separate file through the CSV. So let's turn to the ORD and I'll show you how this works. Now, just a reminder very quickly before we bring in the the IRD file, that you can update your feature definitions using feature remapper. You could have done it prior to importing it, or you can import it and then remap it afterward in the DGN. It's kind of up to you. One limitation when bringing in a corridor from an IRD file, and that is when you bring it in, your baseline geometry has to exist in the same model. You can't put your geometry in a reference file, reference it in, it's going to give you an error message. It has to exist in that file. Now, after you've got the corridor imported, you could always put the geometry in a separate file, reference it in, and reassign the corridor to the reference after the fact. So let's take a look at how this works. So I'm in a blank file. I'm going to reference in some of the data that we brought in earlier. So I'm going to reference in my geometry, my terrains, and my super elevation. So I bring them all in. I'm going to go ahead and set my terrain to be active in ORD. And then let me just go over here and turn a few of these files off to make it a little bit cleaner as we watch this process here. So I'll just leave my geometry in here as well as my super elevation. So I just go under my corridor, I go to import IRD. It's a real simple process. You just navigate to your IRD file, and remember, an IRD can have multiple corridors in it, so I choose the corridor that I want. Now, if it finds any missing dependencies, it's going to stop you and say, hey, this is very important. You want to save these off into a report, because we're going to come back and look at those a little bit later. So I mapped it in. Now, in this case, I had not remapped my IRD prior to bringing it in. So you'll notice it comes in, it can't find the right features. Maybe I've changed some things, so it all comes in white. So this would be where you would run feature remapper, as we showed earlier, to remap your features and make sure you get all of your symbologies to show up correctly. Now, once I've got that in, I want you to notice that if I go to my point controls, I've got super elevation. So it actually brought my super elevation in with the IRD file. Right now, remember, I wanted my super elevation to be in a separate file. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come in here and delete that super that's in this file. Okay, again, this is two different workflows, but in my workflow, I wanted the super separate, so I'm going to delete the super that came in with my IRD. If I go back to my point controls, you'll notice they've all been removed. They're not there anymore. Now, of course, what I want to do is I want to assign the super elevation that I created earlier from the CSV. So I just locate the super, and then I locate the corridor. And again, just make sure that my super lanes and pivot points and things are being assigned correctly, and say OK, and my super elevation has now been assigned to my corridor. Okay, so let's go take a look at that and just verify that everything looks okay there. I'm just going to do that visually by opening up a cross-section. So we'll just open up a cross-section view here. I'll distort that a little bit so you can see that, yeah, you can see we're over there, the blue line in my 2D view. I'm in the middle of a curve, and you can see the cross-section is being done appropriately. You can also go back to your point controls and notice your super has been assigned. Now, the last thing you need to do is address any missing dependencies. Now, let me explain what those are. When you brought in your corridor, there were some point controls that it couldn't find. It couldn't find the geometry. So you could have eliminated that by bringing that geometry in earlier, and so it would be there and available. But what you're going to have to do here is you're going to need to go create that geometry, reassign those point controls, or remove the point controls, but you need to address any missing dependencies. All right. Let's turn to drainage. Now, I want to show you a couple of workflows here, because remember, I'm not addressing a particular product here. I'm just saying, hey, if you've got a V8i project with non-OpenRoads data, how do you get it in? Well, if you had used Geopack drainage, you would need to import that. If you had used En-ROADS SNS, you would need to import that. Now, unfortunately, because of the length of today's presentation, I'm not going to be able to show you a full video of this, but I will point you to where you can find a full video. So I just want to give you the basics of this. So the basic way you get Geopack drainage into OpenRoads Drainage and Utilities is this. You first go into Geopack drainage, And inside of Geopack Drainage, you open what's called Report Builder. Inside Report Builder, you will generate CSV files for your areas, for your nodes, for your links, and for your inlets. Then what you're going to do is you're going to go into OpenRoads. You're going to create a new file using your desired workspace. You're going to go to Drainage and Utilities. Under Tools, you're going to go to Model Builder. And then basically you're going to point to those spreadsheets and you're going to map the properties in those spreadsheets into Drainage and Utilities in OpenRoads Designer. Now, as I said, I don't have time to go through all of that in today's presentation, but there is a video out on communities. You can just go to the communities, search for Migrating Geopack SS2 project data to OpenRoads Designer. You'll find a full video there with timestamps, and at the 27th minute and at roughly the 53rd minute, there's actually a couple of different options for bringing in your Geopack drainage. So again, I would point you to those for a full video. The same thing is true with import inroads S&S. Let's say you've got some storm and sanitary data in this project, you want to bring it forward. It's actually a little bit simpler to do inroads S&S. You just go straight into a OpenRoads Designer file using your desired workspace. Go under Drainage and Utilities, import inroads. You will get the dialog that you see on the screen. You just point to your XIN file, your structures DAT file, your rainfall data, and of course your SDB file, and you say OK, and it will bring your inroad storm and sanitary directly into OpenRoads D and U. And of course, after that, you might need to clean up any of your feature definitions. Again, there's a full video on communities. Again, you can just go out there, search on Migrating Inroads SS2 project data, and there's a timestamp video, and at the 27 minutes mark roughly, you will see a full video on how to bring in your inroads S&S data. Now, at this point, you have brought in your terrains, your corridors, your geometry, your super elevation, you've brought in your drainage. What about your other graphic data? For example, your sheets. Well, there's no magic here, right? You may or may not need to generate your sheets again. There's no fancy way to press a button and say, hey, take my sheets that are in SS2 and bring them in to Connect. They're going to come forward because they're just graphics, but they're going to basically be non-intelligent graphics, right? So depending on where you are in your project, you may want to leave them alone. Depending on, if you're early enough in your project, again, you may just want to regenerate those with OpenRoads Designer. Finally, remember your best practice. You can go back and regenerate these reports inside of OpenRoads, your geometry, terrain, super corridor, drainage, whatever the case may be. You can compare them to those reports from the originating version and make sure that everything came across okay. All right, that's a V8i with non-OpenRoads data. Now, what if I've got a V8i project and I've actually used some OpenRoads data in it? Okay, how would that work? Well, I'll show you, but first, again, best practice is the same here. Generate those reports for validation, and you'll use them at the end after everything has come through. All right, let's talk a little bit about an application that we want to use to bring OpenRoads data forward. And this application is called Civil File Manager. Now, I'm going to show you, we're going to use Civil File Manager a couple times here in different ways. And I always want to remind everybody, when you run Civil File Manager, make sure you look up at the header. Because, and I'll show you in a minute, you can have multiple versions of OpenRoads on your machine. And you want to make sure that you're running the correct version so your data is being migrated into the correct version. So let's take a look at how this works. So I've got a project. You saw me use it here a little bit earlier. This is an SS4 project. So I've got a lot of different files. For example, corridors. If I go to my corridors folder, you can see my different corridors. I've got geometry, signaling, terrains, a whole 9 yards. Now, I'm in OpenRoads Designer. and I'm going to go open an SS4 terrain. Now, when I do, this is the message you're going to get. It's obsolete data, right? This is SS4 data. You cannot open it directly with OpenRoads Designer. This is by design. Okay, you can't convert it on the fly with ORD. So the question is, okay, well, how do I convert my SS4 data forward? Well, to do that, we're going to use Civil File Manager. Now, there's two ways to run Civil File Manager. The first way is directly from within the product. So I'm just going to create a blank file. I'll just call it test.dgn. And if I go to the backstage under Civil Tools, you'll see this Civil File Manager. And it's going to open up this little application. Okay, so that's one way you can run it, is from within the Civil File Manager is really an external application. We're just kicking it off from within the product. It's actually an exe file that's delivered in your product install directory. So there's other ways you could get access to it. For example, you could create maybe a shortcut on your desktop, or in mine, what I did is I just pinned it to my taskbar. So if you notice at the bottom right, I can just click it and open it at any time. I can do it when I'm in ORD, or I can do it when I'm outside of ORD. So again, here's Civil File Manager. It's pretty straightforward. We're just going to go over to the where my project is, and I'm just going to select my project, this 03 IHL data. Now, the first thing you notice here under Output, it's going to tell me, hey, there's 3 files here that I didn't find any civil data. Now, that's perfectly fine. These could be container files or just plain MicroStation files. But under schema details, you'll also notice here that it lists all the different files that it found SS4 data in, and you can see them over there in this list. So to upgrade them, I'm just going to go to Action, and I'm going to say Upgrade All. And so it's going to load some DLLs, and it's going to go through these upgrading attributes and just a lot of, informational stuff it's given to you. It'll go down through here, and when it's done, it will say upgrade complete. So it's just that straightforward. It goes through the files and it upgrades them for you. Now, one thing I want you to notice, it did create a backup zip file. So you would probably do this anyway, but just in case, it takes all of your SS4 files and it zips them up and makes a backup for you, so that you still have access to that SS4 data in case you need to go back. So let's go open one of our files. So let's drill down into my projects here, and I'll go open a terrain file. And this was one of the files that I tried to open earlier. I'm going to say, hey, open it. Now notice it's going to open it right inside of ORD. There's my terrain. If I select it, it automatically recognizes it as an OpenRoads terrain file. If I want to go in and change, let's say, for example, a feature definition, I can come in here and do this. So it was an SS4, a terrain in SS4 now, or in the OpenRoads V8i, whatever it was, SS10. Now it's inside of ORD, and it's been migrated correctly. Let's go look at a couple of other things. Let's say, for example, my geometry. Let's go choose my geometry file, and let's go open it. And I'll just set the workspace and come into my geometry. You can see I can select it. I get the element handlers, so you can see that it's it's ORD geometry. I can do a report on it if I wanted to validate it again. Let's see something else. We can come in. Let's go look at maybe one of our corridors that we migrated. So let's just choose ramp B, and we'll open ramp B by setting the workspace. It'll come in again. There's the ramp B. You can see the corridor handlers there. If I want to go look at the objects dialog, you can see there's my template drops. I've got my key stations, point controls, parametric constraints, end condition exceptions. All of that stuff migrates forward into Connect, and you've got an active corridor. There's the 3D model, and it is it's ready to go. Okay, now again, if after you've upgraded that data, if you've got any issues with features, once again, just a reminder that this is where you would use feature remapper to address any of those issues with missing or renamed features. Now, A couple of limitations on the Civil File Manager. First of all, it only supports SS4 and SS10 data. It doesn't support SS3. I don't think anybody is running SS3 anymore, so hopefully that won't be a problem, but again, it only supports SS4 and SS10. It also has no support for DNU, or what we used to refer to SUDA data. So you have to bring your SUDA data forward a different way, and we'll show you that here in just a moment. The other limitations to Civil File Manager is the super elevation will come forward, but super elevation, when it comes forward, it's static. It's not going to be, in other words, if you bring it in, you can use it. You can assign it to your corridor will obey it, but it's static. If you need to go back and change your super, it's not going to allow you to do that. So once again, I would just encourage you, most of the time super elevation is really easy to create. If it was me doing this, I would just recreate my super elevation from scratch. Now, I mentioned one thing that the Civil File Manager doesn't support, and that is OpenRoads SUDA data. So you will need to bring this in, through an import process. So again, we've got some videos up there on the community site. Again, you can just go up there and say migrating Geopack SS4 SS10 data, or migrating OpenRoads SS4 SS10 data. Both of those have sections inside of them that talk about bringing SUDA data forward. The workflow is pretty straightforward. You go into V8i, you just put all of your SUDA data into a selection set, you export it out to what's called a submodel, you go into ORD, you import the submodel, and that's pretty much it. If you've got any features that need to be dealt with, you deal with them there. But it's pretty much an export-import process that works pretty well. But again, I would refer you to those videos if you need any specifics on these. Once again, inside this workflow, you have the same issue with sheets. If you remember, back in the SS4 and SS10, you could do a lot of your OpenRoads data with geometry and super and corridors, but your plans production was what we called at the time kind of a left turn, right? You went back into your legacy to produce your sheets. Your sheets are going to come forward, but again, they're not going to be dynamic. They're not going to be linked up to your model the way that they would be if you had generated those in OpenRoads. So we'll leave that up to you. Again, there's no magic button that automatically converts sheets in the V8i versions to sheets in ORD. They're there graphically. If you're far enough along in your project, you may be fine with that. If not, you may want to make the decision to regenerate those. Once you're done, again, a reminder, validate, look at your reports and just generate those reports in OpenRoads and compare them to the reports that came out of V8i, and that'll give you a good, make you feel good inside when all of those match up nice and pretty. All right, the last one we want to look at with the time we have left is migrating OpenRoads data from one version of Connect to another. Again, our best practice is still in place here, right? If you want to be 100% sure that your data that was, say, in 10.8 came forward into 10.10, you can generate reports before you migrate that data and just go back in and look at the reports in 10.10 and just validate that everything looks good. So that's always a nice best practice to do. Now I want to cover a few things. Again, remember here we're talking about taking OpenRoads data that's in a previous version of OpenRoads, for example 10.7 or 10.8 or 10.9, forward into a later version. So I want to make sure that you guys are fully aware of all the functionality and the technology that is available to you. And one of the things that you need to understand is that you have access to something now called side-by-side installations. And what we mean by that is that OpenRoads gives you the ability to install multiple versions on the same machine. So you could have multiple versions of OpenRoads or multiple versions of OpenRail or OpenBridge or OpenSite. Now, we introduced that technology in 2021 R1, or that was the 10.10.01.03 version. So beginning with that version, you could have put, for example, 10.10 on the same machine as 10.8 or 10.9. Now, one thing to be aware of here is side-by-side installations only apply across major versions. If you attempt to install, for example, a minor version alongside its parent, it's just going to do an upgrade. So the easiest way to explain that is this. If you look where I've got the numbers in red, I can install a version of 10.9, a version of 10.10, and a version of 10.11 on the same machine. In fact, if you look at the little screen grab that I took at the bottom of the slide, that's I went into Control Panel, went in and looked at the programs that I have installed on my machine, and you'll look at the far right, you'll notice I have 10.9, 10.10, and 10.11 all installed on my machine. So there's no problem with that whatsoever. However, what you can't do is you can't install a minor version alongside its parent. You can't have 10.10.00 and 10.10.01 and 10.10.02 installed on the same machine. That in the eyes of side by side, that's all the same version, right? It's minor versions of the same parent. So again, keep that in mind as you try to make use of side by side installations. The second thing I want to point out about migrating data, and I want to make sure you guys get this, because I get emails on this and I'm not sure everybody understands this, but you do not have to migrate your entire project at one time. You can migrate on a file by file basis. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So let's go back to my project. Originally, this was a project, some project data, and you saw me just earlier use Civil File Manager to bring this forward, and I brought it into a 10.10 version. So everything I've got sitting in my project right now is 2021 R1. Now let's say that I install 2022 R1, which is our upcoming version on my machine. Now I want to bring that data forward. So one of the ways I can do it is just on a file by file basis. So what you see me running right here is 2022 R1. Again, this is our upcoming version of 10.11. Now I'm going to go into one of my files. So let's go into a corridor file, and it immediately says, hey, this file is a 10.10 version, update 10 version. Do you want to bring it forward into 2022 R1? I'm going to say yes. So what it can do is it can automatically upgrade that single file for me, right? Now, if I come in here, you'll notice this corridor is active. It's actually reading my 10.10 geometry file that's referenced in. You can see it, my key stations are being calculated, my point controls. It has no problem reading my alignment data, even though it's in a previous version. If I go to cut a cross section, notice it's reading my terrain data, even though I haven't upgraded my terrain data yet. It has no problem doing that as a reference file. So I didn't have to upgrade everything. That's my point here, in order to use my corridors. Now, at some point, I will probably want to go into one of those files. Let's say, for example, I want to go into one of my geometry files. At that time, it's going to say, hey, this is a 10.10 file. Do you want to go to 10.11? At that time, I'm going to say, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to get into my geometry file. Notice I'm going to select one of my alignments. I'm going to open the profile, and notice it's reading the terrain and calculating the existing profile, even though my existing ground line is still an older version. It has no problem doing that. So now at some point, I will probably go into my terrain file like I'm doing here. And of course, when I do that, it's going to say, hey, are you ready to upgrade the terrain file? And I'm going to say yes. But again, my point here is you do not have to upgrade all of your files at the same time. Multiple versions can work across references like that. And I want to make sure and point that out because I'm not sure a lot of people really understand that. Now, what if, though, you wanted to upgrade your entire project? Let's say you've got a 10.8 and you want to bring it to 10.10, or I've got a 10.9 and I want to bring into 10.11. You can do that, of course, through Civil File Manager. So here I am in Civil File Manager. Notice I'm running at the top left. It says 10.11. So I'm going to go select my project, which remember is 10.10. And if I go to Schema Details, notice it gives me the product version. It says, hey, all these files were in Update 10. What do you want to do? And I'm going to say, let's upgrade those to Update 11. Again, I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing there, but it's going to go through the same informational stuff that it did earlier. And when it's all said and done, it's going to be finished, and it's going to say that it's all done there. Okay. So you can do the whole project at one time, or you can do it on a file by file basis. A couple other things, and again, this really has not so much to do with migrating data, but it does have to do with sharing data, and I want to make sure that you guys are aware of this. In OpenRoads, if you go to the backstage under Civil Tools, you have a tool called Downgrade DGN. And what this allows you to do, in the same way that OpenRoads and Civil File Manager can upgrade data, it can also downgrade data. So we support 2 previous versions. So in the one that I'm running here, I'm actually running 10.11, which is our upcoming release. You'll notice on the dialog in the lower left, you can downgrade this back to 10.10, or you can downgrade it back to 10.9. So if I was working on a project, I had moved up to 10.11, somebody else was, for whatever reason, was still in 10.9 or 10.10, and they needed to access my data, I could downgrade it and give it to them. You'll also notice that one of the options is Remove Civil Model. Basically what this does is it gives you the ability, if you needed to send the file to somebody and you wanted to remove all the civil intelligence, you just wanted to leave vanilla graphics, this gives you a way to do that as well. Last thing on this dialog, it's available from the backstage when you're running ORD. It's also available from the action drop down inside of Civil File Manager. So you can downgrade a single file, or you can downgrade an entire folder or project. So you want to keep that in mind. Last thing here I want to share with you is workspace compatibility. Again, this is a question that we get a lot. I want to make sure everybody is clear on this. Now, you are perfectly welcome to, with side by side, to have multiple workspaces running. So I showed you my machine a little earlier, where I've got OpenRoads Designer 10.9, 10.10, and 10.11 all on my machine. I also have separate workspaces for all 3 of those. If I look under my program data Bentley directory, I have a 10.9 workspace, I have a 10.10 workspace, and I have a 10.11 workspace. That's not a problem, okay, if that's what you want to do. But we hear this a lot. Keep in mind that you can use an older workspace with a newer version of OpenRoads. So let's say, for example, that I'm running 10.10, I've got a 10.10 workspace, and I decide I want to upgrade to 10.11, but I don't have an upgraded workspace. Well, you don't have to. You can put 10.11 on the machine, and the same way that I showed you earlier that a file can use a referenced version of a referenced file that's of an older version, 10.11 can use an older workspace. That's not a problem. So again, you don't have to have all the workspace updated before you can migrate to the new version. Now, be careful, right? Because if you were to go over to that workspace and access, for example, a DGN Lib, it's going to say, hey, do you want to upgrade this? Yes or no? And so if you upgrade it, now it's a 10.11 file, right? So you got to be careful of that. But I did want to make sure everybody knows that older workspaces, older version workspaces, are compatible with newer versions of OpenRoads. Well, that's all I've got.